My name is Avi Bornstein. I'm the Interim Dean of Graduate Studies and Interim Associate Provost. And I want to welcome you to this lecture that's been part of our long-running, now into a third semester of our HSI, Hispanic Serving Institutions series, dealing with different issues that are related to our identity as a diverse institution, as a Hispanic serving institution, an important part of our identity. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Xavier Perez. He is the director and co-founder of the Criminology program at DePaul University in Chicago. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois. He is an advocate for critical and inclusive perspectives in criminology. Growing up in Chicago, Dr. Perez experienced the social consequences associated with disinvestment, housing segregation, and incarceration. As a scholar, Dr. Perez's research interests address two broad areas of study: criminology and Latinx crime, specifically what distinguishes Latinx communities from other racial ethnic groups in America. Dr. Perez's research interests also explore the variations in legal traditions around the world and the implications of such variations on crime policies. In particular, he examines police-community relations in Puerto Rico. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Xavier Perez. Please.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your attendance. Let me first begin with acknowledging Dr. Bornstein and his staff. This is actually my first time in New York, so they were very hospitable, and I want to thank them for all of their support and guidance and then bringing me here. Like I mentioned, I am also the director and the co-founder of the Criminology program at DePaul. So I want to speak a little bit about some of the visions that we have for our program in Chicago, and then the importance of considering alternative perspectives in the criminal justice system. So that is the title of my presentation, Critical Perspectives in Criminology, Moving Beyond the Rhetoric of Law and Order. So I think it's always important for me to speak a little bit about my personal history, so I will talk a little bit of that. I grew up in the Humboldt Park neighborhood of Chicago. It is a predominantly working class Puerto Rican community. Like all working class communities, Humboldt Park had its share of social ills like poverty, underfunded schools, lack of adequate housing, and crime. As a young minority male in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I became involved in the streets. By the age of 15, I was getting myself in all sorts of trouble. I found myself incarcerated at the Juvenile Detention Center and under the supervision of all sorts of other state-operated institutions. Of course, I applied myself to school, straightened out, attended the State Flag University, which is U of I down in Illinois, and then also all of my kids have attended there. I earned a PhD in criminology and co-founded the program, the Criminology program at Chicago. Without discussing much more, it is a remarkable story nonetheless. A young immigrant child gets in trouble with the law at a young age, reforms himself, and stands as a symbol of individualism and merit. Doesn't it just sound like, what do I want to say? I don't want to curse, right? But doesn't it just sound like almost something that could just symbolize the way that we think about equity and justice and fair and merit, that is everything that is associated with sort of American society. However, what we have to keep in mind, I feel it's important to tell my story without really going into some of the more graphic details of it, really to recognize the efforts of countless people and community organizations that guided my direction, right? We like to think about society as being one of individualism and of merit and pulling myself up by my bootstraps, but certainly I would challenge that idea. I did not arrive where I am by myself at all. If there was any sort, there was certainly absence in my growing up and absence in my family. But in that absence, it was filled by programs, and it was filled by individuals, and it was filled by a lot of generosity and a lot of commitment to me as an individual. So I'm always here first and foremost to always give thanks and homage to the individuals that sacrificed and really believed in me, right? I think when I look at my personal experience, and it's a very tragic one, and in my limited time, I don't have much time to get into it, but it's a tragic experience and everything that I have lost, but the people that really made it possible for me were people that just believed. People who believed beyond any sort of criminality, or people who looked at me for the potential that I had demonstrated. So I'm really, as I told them that I am coming here, many of them continue to be moved to tears about the success that I've accomplished. And then I get sort of teary when I speak with them, because I really think about their influences that they had in my life. So principally, I talk about my life story as to challenge this idea of individualism and of merit, right? Principally, that it's not individualism, and it wasn't just merit. It was a lot of community effort that helped me. I am the marker of the success of countless of people in Humboldt Park that were there and believed in me. Second, I speak about the history because I want to challenge many of our assumptions regarding merit, regarding criminality, regarding the academic institutions, right? So in this presentation, I'm going to take a lot of jabs against academia, so just kind of be ready for it. First of all, I disagree with the argument that my success is a product of individualism or merit. I did not simply pull up myself up by bootstraps and make a rational choice, weighing out the pros and cons to become a productive member in society. At every moment in every stage of my life, community folk literally held my hands throughout the process. I demonstrated a high level of academic potential. Therefore, school counselors, they encouraged me to participate in all sorts of programs. I was almost like an experiment for them. If there was some sort of funding that somebody received in the community, then they always had in mind who they thought they were going to put in that program. And so my childhood really was just after-school program after after-school program, just ways in which I would just stay out of trouble. I actually bring that up. It's difficult to really see what that picture is, but that is a picture of the Juvenile Detention Center. And that's when I think about some of the efforts that really changed my life. I remember vividly as it was yesterday, that me being locked up and thinking about where my direction was going. And I remember thinking that I was going to be successful. See, the thing about the streets is that once you start getting into trouble and once you start becoming incarcerated, you're bound to go somewhere great. At least I always thought it was. And so the greatness that I envisioned being on the street was simply just being the leader of my gang, and then going to prison and then meeting my chiefs. And so I looked at that as my goal, and I certainly was on the path to becoming successful. I had been arrested and incarcerated multiple times. All of this is a minor, mind you. And so then when I was, every time I came back with that much more credibility and with that much more authority back on the streets. And so I'm sitting there one day looking at a beautiful mural inside of the detention center that somebody had written. And I'm sort of envious thinking about, I wish I had the artistic skills to be able to draw this same sort of gang, right? It's a gang symbol, the size of the wall. And I think to myself at that moment, like, I know where this path goes, and I know I'm going to be successful in this avenue as well. But I thought to myself, what if I tried a different path? What if I listened to a little bit more to the individuals that were trying to believe in me? And so I made some decisions to do that, to kind of trust them, really. And so many of the ways, I think when we come across young people, and maybe we're sort of like troubled, I think about where I am today. I am the director and one of the co-founders of a prominent university of a criminology program. I sit there and I wonder about all of the people that I encountered when I was like 15 or 16 years old, and the headache that I probably put them through, right? And thought about, that they believed in me in a way that I never believed in myself. And so when I think about when you all come across young people, when you all come across this idea of criminals or felons or whatever sort of derogatory names that we have for individuals that we consider to be outsiders, there is certainly potential. And I ask all of you all to consider that when you're thinking about how do we humanize this process, how do we include marginalized voices. Part of it is just simply looking beyond any of the socially constructed notions of criminality that has been placed on top of those individuals. Because certainly I was not an angel. By 15, I had been arrested and incarcerated multiple times, and I didn't turn into an angel. And I don't know that I consider myself an angel today. I'm still revolutionary in my own ways. But that path to me was a very long path. And no one throughout that time really gave up on me. I think about the times of some of the more difficult times I had in school. I grew up in a time in which it was a little bit, at least in my environment, it was tolerated or maybe understood that you were going to fail in society. And so, but there was almost this sort of understanding that you were going to rebound. I don't think, when I think about young people today growing up, I think they grow up in a particularly punitive time that I don't know that I would have been able to grow up in. Certainly not in Chicago. I dropped out of school 3 times. In today's climate, Chicago would not tolerate me dropping out of school once. They would have gotten rid of me. But every time I went back to school, I just decided I just didn't need school for a couple months, or maybe that year, you know. So my whole sophomore year, I decided not to go to school. And then part of my junior year, and then even part of my senior year. But I just came back, and they always knew that I had the potential. Well, one of those times when they were sort of having a hard conversation with me, and it was always like an intervention. You would have counselors, you would have the police officers in there too because they cared. You would have the security guards, certainly all my teachers, all of the adults. So it's like this sort of communal meeting to talk to me and kind of scold me a little bit about what I was doing with my life. And so I'm there angry, as you can imagine, a 16-year-old getting screamed at by the world. And I'm there resentful at everybody. And I remember the words that have never left my consciousness. And it was my teacher, it was Mr. Kuhn, who was my history professor, history teacher. And he just said something to me that has always resonated to me. And he was like, Javier, you know the one regret I have in life is that I'm not going to see you when you are shining. I'm not going to see you when you are great. Because he was already older, and he envisioned that whenever that day was going to come, it was going to be past his life. And I don't know, there was something about that day that has always carried with me. And I think about that today, that it's in this very sad way, that Mr. Kuhn is not around to see what has been sort of the fruits of his labor. And so when I talk to people and think and have them consider about the approaches that we have and thinking about alternative to punishment, it really is an alternative if you believe in the sort of current paradigm of retribution and of punishment. I think this idea of believing in people has always been the narrative of humanity. And this idea of offering people the opportunity to rebound and redemption from mistakes that they've had has always been our story. Only more recently do you have this emphasis on punishment that we have today. I do have a script here. I also want to challenge the notion of this idea of the academy, particularly as a descendant of the colonized people of the Western Hemisphere. I challenge power dynamics inherent in studying criminal subject or the other. I call into question the definitions of criminal behavior, the role of the state to preserve authority, and the benefits that come with academics who legitimize the state and who conduct research only to sort of further their professional careers. As an insider, I challenge notions of subjectivity regarding my research. In fact, I disagree with the whole notion of objectivity. Academics benefit from their relationship with criminal justice agencies. Researchers may apply statistical models to their research and call it objective. However, they are rare to challenge those relationships with criminal justice agencies, or in many instances challenge the funding sources, because that jeopardizes their careers. And so when I think about, honestly, when I talk to my students, I throw it back on them. If you're looking for some sort of symbol to challenge the system, then I would say look at it in yourself. You're gonna be disappointed looking at it in the area of professors. And again, I don't mean to be jabbing at the academics in the class, but I'm just gonna call it from my perspective, right? And this is what I was invited here to do, to speak honestly from the heart. Certainly there are some of us, right? So I would certainly work with you to challenge that. In many ways, maybe even to my own detriment, because my career and my self-worth is not determined by what happens in academia. My career and self-worth is to the people that already believed in me. They believed in me when I was incarcerated, right? So I owe them, and then to the people of my community, to the working class Puerto Rican community that I grew up in. Those are the ones that I sort of value. But certainly for all of the other academics, and there's plenty, and the criminal justice system and criminology has plenty of professors who think about their personal and professional careers before they ever really think about what are the consequences of the research. And in many ways, do their research challenge any notions of conventionality and of criminal behavior? When we think about the traditional perspective, it's grounded in the Enlightenment philosophers of when they think about Beccaria and Bentham, when they propose both choice theories and then also the hedonistic calculation, this idea that deterrence could be achieved through severity of punishment and freedom. The positivist school characterized criminal behavior as something psychological or pathological. So you have this, again, this founding of our understanding of crime simply as a deficit, something pathological. Traditionally, the definitions of criminality consider marginalized group as a threat. Marginalized groups do not work and drain the social resources. They are poor through many of their choices that they have made, and so they're reviled for those choices. The solution to expand the state's authority and control over the poor is really grounded. I think one of the first theories that we discuss, even at a graduate level sort of seminars, when we talk about the criminal justice system, and in many ways we are talking about the history of the state, but the legitimization of the state, right? How in many ways we see the state, and we understand the state in a way that we need the state. Certainly we need the state. It's part of the social contract, but in the program that we've created, we try to envision a type of justice that does not rely on the state. Certainly we collaborate with the state, but it's a justice that is created within community. We created a concentration. At DePaul, we have concentrations or like specialized areas. And one of the ones that I am most proud about is our effort in community justice. That is the concentration that we have. And so we go into communities really that have this, in which the state has failed them. And so they can't rely on the state. They're either over-policed because there's an abundance of just policing initiatives, but they're also under-policed at the same time. So when they call for help, then the police does not show up. So it's not far. You don't have to go to other parts of the world to see that the state failed its communities. You could clearly, and I would imagine here in New York as well, that could get on one of these trains and go see areas that the state has failed or the state has collapsed in those communities. And so what do? In those communities where the state has failed is where you need to develop some sort of methods for you to help each other and deal with conflict resolution. So when I think back about my education, in many ways it never taught me how to challenge the state or how to envision a just society outside of the state. It taught me that I needed the state and we needed the state to deal with punishment. I'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about the alternative perspectives. When you think about the solutions, principally you think about situational crime prevention strategies that increase the effort to commit crime, increase the likelihood to detect crime, and reduce available resources, right? So it's everything that you think in response to deterrence and in response to the choice theories. That if you make the punishment that much more severe, that people will not engage in criminal activity. I think that when I think about the choice theories, I think you could argue for choice if you have good options. If you have good options in front of you and you make some bad choices, well, then that kind of makes sense. But if you have bad options in front of you, every option is bad. Then at that instance, you are making the best possible decision out of all bad choices, right? There's all bad options there. And so when I think about one of the critiques that I have when I speak about the choice theories in the Enlightenment period is that it seems to be very detached from the life sort of challenges that people have. You can make punishment as severe as you'd like, but if they're starving and people are in need of some sort of resources, then that punishment doesn't really mean anything to them. A better alternative might just be to actually address some of the causes of criminal behavior in society. This utilitarian perspective does not address all crimes and in many ways only seems to address very specific, narrow-minded notions of criminal behavior. It also only focuses on street crime, right? So this is something, we speak at length about who defines what is criminal behavior in society. Namely, think about all of the categories that are missing when you talk about criminal behavior. There's certainly no discussions of white-collar crime or corporate crime. So those are the conversations that we have, and that would be another critique. In many ways, as I always argued, much of our policies regarding crime do not really address the causes of crime. Crime is a symptom of something else. And so as long as we continue to deal with the symptoms, we're never getting to the cause. I could guarantee you that every policy or every procedure that is presented, if it does not deal with the causes of criminality, is bound to fail. I know that right away. When I'm listening to whatever initiatives the city might propose or solutions that are presented by government agencies, if it doesn't address the core causes of criminality, then they're just all bound to fail. It leaves communities who are in need of assistance and experiencing crime isolated and alone. So again, when you put the onus on these individuals to solve crime for themselves, then becomes problematic because you abandon. The state essentially has abandoned those communities. I grew up in a time in Chicago post the riots, right? When you think about the riots of the 1960s and the 1970s, I grew up in a time that this is just the way I understood the world. I understood the world as being disinvested, and the city turned away from my community. So I grew up in the time to see the background of the community that had burned. And so in that time, you really think about the context. You have jobs that have left the city. You have now the post-period after the riots, and you have the introduction of drugs and of cocaine and of crack. And I feel like crime is a symptom of these issues in which people are they're screaming. People are screaming for help. And what has been the response of society? We become punitive during this time period. We enact the tough on crime laws, the war on drugs, that decimated working class communities of color, right? So that's when I think about the sort of policies that were enacted in response to community struggles, they really become very punitive in their outcomes. The traditional notions of criminality reinforce fear and punitive responses. Rather than exploring the causes of crime, society focuses on the attention of controlling the most vulnerable groups. Community residents are encouraged to maintain social order through situational crime prevention efforts. Residents who fear for their safety and perceive the criminal justice system as incompetent are invited to police their neighbors and to call police for any suspicious behavior. So again, when you think about this sort of moving away from taking care of society, of the most vulnerable, in its place, the state understood that it did not have the resources to deal with crime. And so they now invite other individuals who are within the community to participate in that process. So in many ways, it's the way that you really see what is taking place is the state has absolved itself from taking care of communities and taking care of the most vulnerable, and really in many ways has left it on the hands of community residents. And so that's what you see. You see this sort of self-policing. And there's just too many incidences and to go over them. And actually some of them are rather comical. When you think about, if you reflect back on this past year and you think about all of the incidences in which people are calling the police because they see young African-American kids hanging out, or they see young Latino kids who are not part of some group on themselves, is this sort of, the community and individuals have been now employed by the state to continue with that sort of punitive response. You see instances in which in the past, there were these nurturing environments that had no place for the criminal justice system. But places like parks. Today you see parks and you see schools, you see other places that were traditionally considered. When I mentioned about, I don't think that I would survive in today's society as a child, is because those places continue to be nurturing environments for me, even during my most troublesome years. Today, there is just surveillance and punishment all around those communities that certainly, there's no doubt in my mind that if I grew up in today's time with the trouble that I was getting into, that would certainly follow that path into criminality and follow the path into incarceration. So what do we see is these efforts legitimize the state's authority over marginalized communities. It has not addressed the inequalities of power between the state and the communities under social control. And what's more, the state invites community agents or community engagement. It also shifts the responsibility away from the state to those communities. Some of the concerns regarding these traditional images, namely, is simply that they stereotype and define certain groups as criminal and deserving of punishment. I always challenge my students to think about, if we are fighting a war on drugs, which we're failing miserably, the United States incarcerates more people than any of the Western societies. We incarcerate more people than China has. And China has over three times our population as a country, and we have more people incarcerated. When you think about the consequences associated with it, drugs today are just as valuable. They're just as available today as they were in the past. So these draconian policies, if they worked, you could have maybe make an argument that they were effective. But drugs are available today just as much as they were in the past, and we've decimated working class communities in the process. If we are waging a war against drugs, where is that war fought and who is the enemy? That's the policies that we need to consider. And when we think about what are the consequences, you see whole groups of certain ages within these populations, young minority males, who are just absent. Go into communities of color. Where are the 20-year-old young minority males? Where are the young minority males in upper ed? I haven't asked for that. You know, my sort of conclusion is they're in prisons. The policies that have been enacted over the last 40 years has shifted those populations from participating in traditional economies and attending schools to now being the dragnet that we see. They're referred to as like fishnets, right? Our ideas of trying to capture criminals are that we cast these fishnets into society, hoping to capture those major criminals, whether they are the drug dealers or whether they're like the kingpin sort of gang leaders, right, in our imagination. The reality is that you might catch a handful of those, you might catch a couple of those, I'll give you that. But in the process, you're probably catching a whole lot of other little fish that have no business to being in the criminal justice system. And that's the consequences of our policies. Community watch groups transfer the co-responsibility of the state to the individual members. There's little evidence that those community watch groups reduce crime. And what is more concerning is that many of them participate in activities that are considered to be outside of legitimate practices. The self-policing efforts encourage community residents to take precautionary measures, to arm themselves, and to neutralize any perceived threat, right? So this is when you think about the Trayvon Martin and other instances, this is the consequence. The consequence is when we empower people with very biased perspectives about young minority males to take some sort of action, then of course there's no surprise to see what results from it. People of color experience higher levels of conflictive policing strategies and other various forms of police misconduct. Young minority males are perceived to be the symbolic assailants by the criminal justice system and the popular imagination. Many communities experience heightened levels of distrust and dissatisfaction with the police. Another sort of consequence that we've seen as the result of the war on drugs is you see the militarization of police all throughout the country. You have many jurisdictions throughout the country that drugs wasn't even a priority or a concern. But because the federal government has its ways of securing funding or providing funding if local police departments, if they follow the sort of priorities of the federal government, then they have to in order to receive that funding. And so you see local agencies all throughout the country now start to apply for some sort of military training, right? And the consequence has been is that when you are trained as a military, you're trained to deal with people as enemy combatants, not to train, that's not policing. And so that as a consequence, you see all of the sort of connection of the war on drugs and the way that it's transferred or is the way that it's transformed many of the community relationships with law enforcement. Another concern that we have is this sort of the role of academia. Criminology has focused on undeveloped or poor areas. It has not focused on the crime of the powerful. In many ways, when you think about the level of which white-collar crime and corporate crime takes place, they're not crimes, right? In many ways, they might be thought of like policy infractions, but there's no specific really laws to prosecute the wealthy in society. If there's any sort of instance in which somebody could be found guilty, then they're not going to go through trial. They're going to participate in some sort of agreement in which does not label them as criminal. And so they're never repeat offenders. There's no repeat offenders for white-collar crime. There's certainly all sorts of repeat offending laws for street crime, but there's nothing in the way of white-collar crime. So when you think about, one of the courses that we offer is about white-collar and corporate crime. And what I have an agent from the Department of Commerce come teach that class. And what he really does is he spends the quarter just explaining to them about the way that the rich are able to manipulate the laws in society. And in a given year, mind you, he's got all the resources of the federal government behind him. In a given year, he is lucky to make 2 arrests. And so when you think about the sort of the lack of resources that are provided towards dealing with white-collar crime, and the way that criminology is just mute on this. Criminology does not make an argument for us to go and address white-collar crime. Criminology, alongside the FBI and the Index 1 crimes, really particularly focus only on street crime. By focusing on working class or impoverished communities, criminology has maintained the traditional notions of criminality. The study of crime is synonymous with the poor, with marginalized urban communities. The crimes of the wealthy do not receive the same attention, and if caught, they are rarely prosecuted. In many instances, criminology upholds the legal system while condemning any sort of political action or dissent. There is this study that was produced in Chicago regarding procedural justice. And I say it only because some of my professors, when I was in graduate school, were part of that study. And although I admire those professors, and they certainly had a positive influence in my life, they offered me some RA positions, right? So I worked with them, and they were great bosses. Their politics just doesn't match well with my politics. And I think about, they were so invested in working with police agencies that they never really thought about transforming it. And so there's these efforts, or there's reports that are coming out of Chicago that many of the officers who participate in those procedural justice trainings and the sort of discrimination, the anti-bias trainings, are the ones who are being named in many of the allegations of police brutality. So how does that happen? How is it that you have some of your trained officers, when you have these train the trainers, right? So they now become the trainers, right? They're the ones who are being now the face of what you think about procedural justice and you think about anti-discriminatory practices. They are the ones who are being leveled with many of these accusations, right? And there's video, so you can't even deny it, right? You see some incidences of police brutality on their part. We participated in many of these programs as well at my current university, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge when you go into an environment in which there's certainly some reception for it, but there is also a lot of resistance against it. And so you have officers that really, I was talking about this earlier during lunch, I've never been in an instance in which a classroom, the curriculum or the lecture was just shut down. Like in my classroom, it just would never unravel to that. I could never fathom an instance in which the opposition to the material was so staunch that it shut down the training. We were not going to talk about police brutality. We were not going to talk about dynamics of race. We were not going to talk about the historical legacy of racism and the role of police in that training. And so as one of the evaluators, that was my research project, right? 'Cause they just shut it down. So there was nothing really to evaluate because we could not complete the training. The only thing I was able, only in academia is a failure, a success. So we were able to write some lessons learned from this, right? But when I think about, again, that professor who was part of that training, who conducted that research, and who demonstrated that they had seen changes in attitudes and behaviors, now to have some of those same officers be implicated in some incidences of police brutality, I think about our politics again. And although I admire those professors, I think about that politically, I think we're just talking about different worlds here. I envision a world, and I think about the individuals from my community that I need to advocate on behalf of. When we think about an alternative perspective, what would that look like? I mentioned this at the beginning, that historically, the modern state is a recent phenomenon. And so I spend a lot of time in my classes talking about history so that people understand that once upon a time, which wasn't even that long ago, individuals resolve conflict with each other. When you commit a crime, it's not the victim versus you, it's you versus, or the state versus you, right, which has its own problems in itself. But this notion that the state took authority to resolve conflict is very problematic. The state, to legitimize itself again, had to take punishment for people. When you think about one of the ways in which the state developed and came to be, in the past, when I say the past, I think about the Middle Ages. Before that time, restorative justice was the way, and conflict resolution was the way that people resolved. Certainly there was retribution at the time as well, but in today's society, retribution is the way that we think about punishment. We don't really think about alternative perspectives, and we don't think about restorative justice. As to somehow suggest that restorative justice is a recent phenomenon. I would argue that restorative justice has been the story of punishment and of namely conflict resolution between individuals. Up until 1670, in France, it was forbidden for the state to intervene when two people had arrived at some sort of conclusion. Imagine that. Imagine the time in which if somebody committed a crime against you or a wrong act against you, if you arrived at some sort of conclusion with that individual, then the state had no business in it. Again, I don't mean to suggest that we do not need the state, but when you go to communities in which the state has failed, then you cannot rely on the state. Maybe there will be a time in which we could rely on the state. But in those communities, and I can speak about in my communities, we got to think about ways for us to arrive at those conclusions together and to deal with conflict management together rather than relying on the state. As criminal justice programs grew throughout the country, our discipline discarded any discussion regarding moral reflection. Universities capitalized on new revenue sources without considering the role of academic, or without considering the role of discussing dynamics of power. As a discipline, we prepare individuals for the profession without discussing their role in the historical legacy of discrimination, oppression, and social exclusion. Right? When I speak about this, I speak about the growth of the criminal justice programs all throughout the country. Then in many ways, universities thought about ways to capitalize on revenue sources without considering some of the ethics regarding these programs. Ethics and also some of the moral reflection. As a discipline, we must advocate on behalf of the most impoverished and marginalized voices in our society. We must acknowledge marginalized voices as experts, not us. After all, they possess the knowledge to assess the problem, to design policy responses, and to ensure safety in those communities. This approach empowers individuals so they have a positive impact on society. We must abandon the draconian policies of getting tough on crime and the war on drugs. We must connect individual behavior to social context and to better understand the causes of crime. We wrongfully assume that the poor communities are socially disorganized. I would say that even in the poorest communities and the areas with the highest rates of crime, you could find social organization. In fact, many poor neighborhoods incorporate elements of informal social controls. In short, we must change the social conditions which contribute to the causes of crime. When we think about social and political change, throughout the 1970s, if you want to romanticize the time, we see a lot of community engagement. The community worked together to solve problems which surfaced when people worked communally together. Community residents coordinated local institutions, groups, and agencies to work together and bring about change of community organizing. Out of necessity, these marginalized voices created alternative spaces for resistance. By defining communities as problematic, society captures a particular perspective that forgets or ignores the specific histories. When I go into communities, particularly to my community, I go and sort of tell them about the history, about this time period in which people worked together and developed community to be able to address crime. I go into these communities to inform them about their rights when they are in the custody of the criminal justice system so that they understand what can and it should not take place. Community control allows for the inclusion of marginalized voices. This bottoms-up approach allowed community residents to include their expertise. And it also allowed for urban poor communities to have voices embedded in the streets and stand up against dominant racialized hierarchies of power. One thing that we gotta consider is that many of the instances in which communities attempt to resist the state or fight back the state are always criminalized. So whenever we think about riots and we think about political statements, well, the thing is that we never think about them as political statements. We think about riots as almost a crime, certainly maybe destruction of property, but we don't think about them as political actions. When we think about alternative perspectives, I think it's important for us to think about what is the reason why people are committing crime. In the 1960s, America burned, which kind of similar that you saw around the 2015 time period. But in the 1960s, the Kerner Commission examined why communities burned. And they really came to some conclusions that continue to this day. At the heart of it, why did communities riot? Housing segregation, lack of economic opportunities, a sense of hopelessness, police brutality. When you look at all of the incidences since then, the Kerner Commission was published in the late 1960s, many of those circumstances considered today. When I mentioned the Kerner Commission to my students, we don't need another commission. We don't need any sort of research to understand what are the causes of crime. We know what are the causes of crime, and we know how to fix them. We've known that for a time period. As a society, that's the sort of detachment. Our values are just not there to deal with issues of crime and to empower and to invest in poor communities. Some of the successes that we've had experiencing at DePaul is namely that we are guided by our mission statement. So the university is sensitive to and care for the needs of others and to serve those individuals. At DePaul, we develop a curriculum that speaks to our Vincentian values. We prepare individuals for the workplace, but also address the ethical concerns associated with social control. Both implicitly and explicitly, we envision a just and fair society. As such, we incorporate dynamics of power in all of our courses. When you think about social transformation, it is embedded into our learning objectives of the major. So it really is an excellent opportunity for us to really envision a just society an hour and a half at a time, right? In each lecture, we enter, and this is something when we think about the individuals that we hire to teach our courses. The beauty about working at DePaul is that because we are such value-driven with our mission, that part of the interview process is really asking people about their visions of what a social just society would look like. And so we've had the opportunity to offer these opportunities for students to participate in subtle works of abolition, to humanize the process, and to introduce philosophies of redemption in this program. In terms of policy recommendations, I've been speaking about marginalized voices like myself. So I would certainly encourage all of you all to look beyond the narrative of crime and punishment, to look beyond the narrative of kids who are out there who are just getting into sort of trouble and really just needing of punishment. We need to envision an inclusionary community without demonizing the other. We need a social justice approach that utilizes the assets of community. So when we talk about community justice in our program, we speak about looking at community through an assets-based perspective, right? And so the traditional perspective looks at criminology from a deficit-based perspective, almost like this expectation that they're going to fail. And so our goal is to go into communities and look at the contributions and the potential that they have, much in the same way that those teachers looked at my potential, my contribution. What we have today is an oppressive practices that involves over-policing, stigmatizing, methods of control, and the like. The paradigm of perceived risk undermines any discussions of inclusion and of solidarity. In terms of course, some of my research touches upon Latinx communities. It's important for us to consider the contributions of Latinos and Latinas in society. The Latinx community challenges many of the assumptions that we have about traditional criminology. They demonstrate low levels of crime despite high levels of poverty. This is referred to as the Latino or Latinx paradox. That you see Latinx communities and also immigrant communities, right? You see immigrant communities with high rates of poverty but low rates of crime. That's a challenge in itself that we have to recognize. We see that Latinx communities create strong kinship ties. They create dense networks of social capital and social support. They attract employers and businesses. They enforce traditional family structures and foster connections to protective institutions. When you think about all of the multiple reasons of why we've seen a decline in crime since the 1990s, you have authors and scholars out there who argue one of the reasons is that such a high growth of the Latinx community. The influx of immigrants into our society has aided in lowering crime rates. So again, in this current climate, we think about immigration as a negative. When we think about immigrants as almost in criminal terms, I would say you want to solve crime, put immigrants into that community, and you'll see the level of infrastructure that starts to develop. The retributive paradigm pits victims against offenders and the state against the lawbreakers. We need to envision a social justice around poverty, inequality of power, and of human rights. The current focus centers on visible signs of economic and social disorder. As a result, social intervention is built around social control. Unfortunately, these social interventions do not examine the social, economic, or political causes of crime. The state defines crime and its solutions. Criminology research legitimizes the state and legitimizes both crime, control, and deviance. We must broaden our definitions of crime and victimization to include white-collar crime, corporate crime, and other areas of victimization. When I think about how do we envision a broader sense of victimization, in my classes I think about the date is approaching. Has anyone ever heard of equal pay day? Right? Equal pay day is the day, oh, I love it. By the time you get into my third, fourth, fifth class, you know what equal pay is. So it lands with certain students. Equal pay day, and so I would ask all of you all, when you have a moment, look at this year's equal pay day. Equal pay day, which is usually around mid-April, so it's close. Equal pay day, in the previous year, males earned a certain amount between January and December. For women, they do not, on average, achieve that amount till about mid-April, and that is considered equal pay day. If you break it down by ethnicity and race, you have African American women who do not achieve that number till sometime in August. And when you look at Latinx communities, they don't achieve that number till, for women, sometime till October. So when you think about that over the lifetime, that's when I think about, that's criminal. When you think about incidences of the United States has amongst Western societies has the highest rate of death during labor, that's criminal, right? We need to envision new ways how we define what is crime and what is victimization. We need a social justice paradigm that does not stigmatize groups and addresses the roots of social problems. We need to consider restorative justice frameworks rooted in notions of relationship and dialogue rather than the adversarial dispute that we have in place today. In my concluding thoughts, I'm always haunted by a comment that a very close friend of mine always makes, and I still cannot change his opinion of it. We grew up in the same neighborhood, and he was an athlete. So because he was an athlete, then he had certain opportunities open up for him, and then he was maybe protected by teachers and by others. So we grew up in the same neighborhood, but we just had vastly different experiences. He was never really harassed by the police, or he didn't have any sort of need to be part of the gangs. So although we went to the same high school, and we were very close friends. We went to U of I together, and we still are very close friends. We have two different experiences. What it reminds me of is that, one is that there's multiple voices and multiple experiences, even in poor communities. But two is that he continues to believe that he never experienced discrimination in his neighborhood. And that always sort of kind of pricks at me a little bit, because I think about how could any minority male not experience any level of discrimination growing up in Humboldt Park, or growing up in the west side of Chicago, or growing up in the south side of Chicago, right? I just can't fathom to imagine that you just never experienced it. Over the years, right, and this is something he's told me ever since we were young. Over the years, I try to make sense and think about this in multiple different ways, right? I could probably just write a paper about the different sort of conclusions I've arrived all throughout my life. What it had me realize was that maybe as a child, I didn't have a name for the level of oppression and discrimination. So I didn't know why those buildings that had rioted and burned 20 years ago were still there. There was no effort to do something about them. I never understood why my educational system was underfunded. My high school, Roberto Clemente, at the time had somewhere around an 85% dropout rate, right? When I think about in my sophomore year, the seniors, that class, there was about 1,600 freshmen, right? So when I was a sophomore, that senior class had 1,600 freshmen. That senior class graduated about 198. This was just the norm. My freshman class had 1,300 students. I think we graduated like 248, right? So we were doing a little better. But I just didn't have a name for that. I didn't have a name to describe the level of mortality, the infant mortality rate in my neighborhood. And I think about, although we experienced life somewhat a little differently, like he was never a victim of police brutality. I had my ribs broken by the police. He was never incarcerated. I was incarcerated multiple times, right? I think this is my sort of critique of my very close friend, is that he sees discrimination and racism in a very narrow way. He doesn't understand institutional discrimination. He didn't know how to name the sort of oppression that is present in these communities. And so that's why I would ask you all too, moving forward, is that you might not have the name for something that is wrong in these communities, but there is some there that is telling you that it is wrong because it's just unfair and unjust. And so I encourage all of you all to continue exploring the way that we think about racial dynamics in society. Let me just conclude with this. There's multiple sort of variations on this quote, but it's this idea of vision is the ability to see the invisible, right? Or this idea, vision is the ability to see what other people cannot. When I reflect back again, and I always conclude by paying homage to the people that were present in my lifetime to where I am today, they saw something I certainly did not. There's no way I would be teaching criminology or criminal justice where I was at 15 years old. I would never imagine that to be the case. They saw a potential inside of me, and they see a potential inside of all people with my background to be better than they were at that moment, and to be greater than whatever sort of definitions have been placed before them. And I challenge and encourage all of us to do the same, to see beyond any notions of criminality and to look at the potential that people have. You just never know. You never know where they might land. And you never know. You never know if you could be the Professor Kuhn that was in my life and the impact that you have, right? I've been around social workers all of my life, and one thing they've told me is that the thing about working in social services is that you just never know the impact. You never know the influence that you will have to wherever the individuals go. I feel very sad that I'll never be able to thank Mr. Kuhn, but he was true. Those words will forever resonate in my mind and in my drive for society, to improve myself for the remainder of my days. In those 15 seconds, Mr. Kuhn said something to me that radically transformed my life. And that's why I challenge all of you out today. The time that you have in front of people who are perceived to be troubled or people who are perceived to be problematic or criminal, however we want to define them, that those 15 seconds could have a meaningful impact and a lifelong impact on their lives moving forward. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to me. Have a great day.